In the cold, damp marketplace of Hereford, a crowd of nobles, merchants, and peasants gathered on a grey November morning in 1326, their breath forming silent clouds against the chill. At the center of their attention stood a wooden platform, a stage for a spectacle of medieval justice that would shock even the most hardened witnesses. Hugh Despenser stood before them, a man who had once wielded more power than any subject in the realm of England, now stripped of everything. His once elegant clothes hung in tatters, his skin marked by the brutal journey from royal favorite to condemned traitor. This was a man who had risen from the shadows of the royal court to become virtually a second king, only to find himself now facing a punishment so savage that it would be remembered for centuries. Just years earlier, Hugh had been the closest confidant of King Edward II, a man whose whispers could change the course of kingdoms. He was not merely an advisor, but a puppeteer who controlled access to the king, manipulated royal finances, and carved out territories as if England were his personal inheritance. Medieval chroniclers would later describe him as King of England in everything but title, a dangerous position that would ultimately seal his fate. His power was not just political, but deeply personal. Rumors swirled through the stone corridors of medieval courts about the intimate nature of his relationship with Edward II. While both men were married with children, the nature of their bond raised eyebrows and sparked dangerous whispers. In an era where masculinity and power were tightly intertwined, such accusations could be more deadly than any sword. Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, watched the proceedings with a complex mixture of revenge and calculated political triumph. Hugh had systematically humiliated her, stripping away her lands, limiting her access to her own children, and reducing her from a royal queen to little more than a political pawn. Now, she would witness his ultimate downfall. The crowd was not merely a passive audience, but active participants in this theatrical moment of vengeance. They had suffered under Hugh's ruthless administration, nobles whose lands were stolen, merchants whose trade was controlled, peasants whose lives were disrupted by his relentless ambition. Today, they would see justice, or what medieval society considered justice. What was about to unfold was more than an execution. It was a carefully choreographed destruction of a man's entire being, physical, political, and symbolic. Hugh Despenser would not simply be killed. He would be systematically dismantled, his body transformed into a warning for anyone who might dare to accumulate too much power. In those moments before his punishment began, Hugh represented something profound about medieval power, the razor-thin line between absolute influence and total annihilation. He had risen from a noble but relatively unremarkable background to become the most feared and hated man in England, a testament to the volatile nature of medieval political life. The platform beneath his feet was more than wood and nails. It was a stage where the complex drama of medieval power would be played out, a performance of punishment that would send a message far beyond this single marketplace, resonating through the corridors of power across England and beyond. As the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the first act of this brutal drama to begin, Hugh Despenser stood as a living embodiment of medieval political audacity, a man whose rise and fall would become a legendary, cautionary tale of ambition, power, and the merciless machinery of medieval justice. When Edward II inherited the English throne in 1307, no one could have predicted how dramatically one man would transform the landscape of power. Hugh Despenser the Younger was not born into the highest nobility, but he understood something fundamental about medieval court dynamics. Proximity to power was power itself. Born around 1290 to a respected but not extraordinary noble family, Hugh was ambitious in a way that transcended traditional aristocratic restraint. He was intelligent, calculating, and possessed an almost preternatural ability to understand the complex web of royal relationships. When he married Eleanor de Clare in 1315, a woman who was not just any noble woman, but the granddaughter of King Edward I, he positioned himself at the very heart of royal networks. The king, Edward II, was a peculiar monarch. Sensitive, emotionally volatile, and more interested in personal relationships than traditional kingship, he found in Hugh a companion who understood and indulged his deepest vulnerabilities. Their relationship quickly evolved beyond mere friendship, becoming something that contemporary chroniclers hinted was far more intimate. By 1322, Hugh had become more than just a royal favorite. He was a political architect, systematically dismantling the power structures that threatened the king's authority. Where previous royal advisors had been cautious, Hugh was ruthless. He engineered the exile and disinheritance of powerful nobles who challenged the king, transforming their lands and wealth into royal and personal assets. The Despencer lands expanded exponentially. In Wales, Hugh became a territorial magnate, acquiring vast estates through a combination of legal manipulation, royal decree, and outright intimidation. He wasn't just accumulating wealth, he was creating a personal kingdom within the kingdom, answerable only to the king. His method was elegant in its brutality. By controlling access to Edward, he became the primary intermediary for all royal communications. Nobles who wanted the king's ear were forced to negotiate through Hugh. Petitions, land grants, judicial decisions, everything flowed through his hands. He was not just an advisor. He was the living embodiment of royal power. Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, watched this transformation with increasing horror. Her influence diminished as Hugh's grew. He systematically removed her supporters, restricted her finances, and even limited her access to her own children. Where she saw a threat, Hugh saw an obstacle to be strategically neutralized. The medieval court was a landscape of constant negotiation, where loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold. Hugh understood this better than anyone. He didn't just serve the king, he became indispensable to him. His intelligence network was vast, his political maneuvering sophisticated. He could predict challenges before they emerged, neutralizing potential rebellions before they could take root. But power has its own gravity, and Hugh was pulling everything toward him. With each land acquisition, each noble marginalized, each royal decree manipulated, he was constructing a precarious tower of influence. The higher it rose, the more unstable its foundation became. By 1326, Hugh Despencer was not just a royal favorite. He was the most powerful man in England, second only to the king himself. But in the delicate ecosystem of medieval politics, such absolute power was never sustainable. The very mechanisms he had used to rise would soon become the instruments of his spectacular downfall. What Hugh could not see, in his moment of apparent triumph, was that every move he made was drawing a map toward his own destruction, a cartography of ambition that would lead directly to one of the most brutal executions in English medieval history. In medieval England, power was a delicate dance of influence, inheritance, and intimidation. But Hugh Despencer had turned that dance into a ruthless performance, treading on ancient noble privileges with a brazenness that would ultimately seal his fate. By 1322, Despencer had transformed from a mere royal favorite into a predatory force consuming the traditional power structures of the English aristocracy. He wasn't just accumulating wealth. He was systematically dismantling the feudal relationships that had governed noble society for generations. Land, that most sacred of medieval currencies, became his primary weapon. Through a calculated series of legal maneuvers and royal endorsements, Despencer began acquiring vast territorial holdings. He didn't just acquire these lands. He stripped existing noble families of their ancestral estates, using King Edward II's authority as his personal weapon. In the Welsh marches especially, he became a voracious land grabber, forcing noble families into humiliating negotiations or complete dispossession. The Welsh lords, traditionally semi-autonomous, found themselves crushed under Despencer's relentless expansionism. He would manipulate royal legal processes, orchestrate strategic marriages, and leverage his intimate relationship with the king to strip away lands that had been held by families for generations. Each acquisition was not just an economic transaction, but a deeply personal wound to noble pride. Nobles who resisted found themselves facing not just legal challenges, but systematic character assassination. Despenser was masterful at creating elaborate networks of informants, using rumors and strategic accusations to undermine potential rivals. Those who challenged him risked not just financial ruin, but total social destruction. Queen Isabella herself became a victim of Despenser's machinations. He systematically limited her political influence, removed her lands, and even separated her from her children, acts that transformed personal antagonism into a simmering political powder keg. By cutting off her resources and dignity, he created a powerful enemy who would ultimately become instrumental in his downfall. The nobility's resentment wasn't merely about lost lands or diminished influence. At its core, Despenser represented a fundamental threat to the medieval social contract. In a world where lineage, honor, and inherited privilege were everything, he was a nouveau riche interloper who used royal favor to rewrite centuries of established social order. Whispers and rumors circulated about the nature of his relationship with King Edward II. While same-sex relationships were taboo, what truly offended the nobles was not necessarily sexual preference, but the way Despenser seemed to manipulate and control the king, bypassing traditional aristocratic channels of influence. By 1325, this simmering resentment had transformed into something more dangerous. A coordinated movement of noble families who saw Despenser not just as a political rival, but as an existential threat to their entire way of life. They were no longer just plotting against a royal favorite. They were preparing for a fundamental restructuring of power. The nobles understood something profound. Despenser wasn't just breaking rules. He was rewriting the entire social manuscript of medieval English aristocracy. And for that, he would pay a price far beyond what even he could imagine. In the shadows of medieval courts and castle halls, a verdict was being quietly prepared. A sentence of total destruction that would make Despenser an eternal symbol of what happens when one man's ambition threatens an entire social ecosystem. Between 1322 and 1326, England wasn't just a kingdom, it was a powder keg of resentment, with Hugh Despenser holding the match. His meteoric rise transformed the delicate political landscape into a treacherous terrain where loyalty meant survival and opposition meant destruction. The Despensers weren't merely ambitious, they were systematically dismantling centuries of baronial traditions. Hugh's strategy was surgical. He didn't just want influence, he wanted absolute control. By manipulating royal charters and land grants, he began transferring enormous estates into his and his father's names, stripping powerful nobles of their ancestral territories and economic foundations. Queen Isabella bore the most visible wounds of this political transformation. Once a powerful French princess, she found herself progressively marginalized, her lands confiscated, her household members imprisoned. Despenser didn't just limit her political power, he deliberately humiliated her, removing her children from her custody and placing them under his own family's control. For a medieval queen, this was more than a personal slight. It was a fundamental violation of her royal status. The king, Edward II, became increasingly isolated. Despenser wasn't just a favorite. He was a gatekeeper who controlled every interaction, every petition, every moment of royal access. Nobles who once would have direct communication with their monarch now had to navigate Despenser's complex web of patronage and punishment. Those who resisted found themselves suddenly impoverished, stripped of titles, or exiled. Foreign policy suffered equally. Despenser's aggressive territorial ambitions in Wales and his confrontational approach to Scottish relations created multiple diplomatic fronts. Where previous kings had sought strategic alliances, Despenser pursued a policy of aggressive expansion that alienated potential allies and provoked unnecessary conflicts. The baronial class, traditionally the backbone of medieval English governance, watched in growing horror. Their ancient privileges were being systematically dismantled by a man they saw not as a statesman, but as an opportunistic upstart. The whispers of discontent became a roar. Despenser wasn't just threatening individual nobles, He was fundamentally restructuring the social contract that had governed English aristocratic life for generations. Religious institutions weren't spared either. Despenser's network of influence penetrated monasteries and church hierarchies, with appointments and land grants becoming tools of political manipulation. Clergy who resisted found themselves swiftly marginalized, their ecclesiastical careers terminated with brutal efficiency. What made Despenser particularly dangerous was his understanding of systemic power. He didn't just accumulate wealth, he created an intricate network of familial and economic dependencies. Merchants, local officials, and lesser nobles became entangled in a web where crossing Despenser meant economic ruin. By 1326, the kingdom was a tinderbox. The barons weren't just plotting rebellion. They were planning a comprehensive dismantling of Despenser's entire power structure. Queen Isabella, humiliated and angry, was forging alliances with her brother, the King of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape English political life forever. Despenser had transformed England from a medieval kingdom into his personal fiefdom. But in doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction, a lesson in the fundamental fragility of unchecked political ambition. By November 1326, the world Hugh Despenser had meticulously constructed was crumbling around him. The landscape of power he had carefully manipulated was about to collapse, with devastating consequences. Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer had invaded England from France, their army moving with calculated precision. They were not merely an invading force, but a coalition of nobles who had endured years of Despenser's ruthless manipulation of the royal court. Every mile they traveled represented another nail in Hugh's coffin. Hugh's fatal flaw had been overreach. Not content with merely advising the king, he had systematically dismantled the traditional power structures of the nobility. He seized lands, redirected royal revenues, and controlled access to King Edward II with a possessiveness that bred deep resentment. Nobles who once might have been allies now saw him as an existential threat. When Isabella landed in Suffolk with her troops, Despenser understood the gravity of the moment. The carefully constructed facade of royal protection was disintegrating. Edward II, once seemingly invincible, now appeared weak and isolated. Hugh's survival instinct kicked in, a mixture of desperation and strategic calculation. They fled west, hoping to reach the relative safety of Wales. Hugh's connections there might provide sanctuary, a potential escape route, but escape was an illusion. The networks of power he had spent years building were now rapidly unraveling. Near Bristol Castle, their options narrowized dramatically. The city's defenses, controlled by Hugh's enemies, meant capture was almost inevitable. When troops surrounded them, the stark reality became clear: there would be no negotiation, no mercy. On the 16th of November 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured. The charges against him were comprehensive and devastating: abuse of royal power, misappropriation of lands, manipulating the king's governance, and personal enrichment at the expense of the nobility. But underlying these legalistic accusations was something more profound: a systematic destruction of feudal power dynamics. The nobles who captured him understood this was more than a mere arrest. This was a public repudiation of everything Despenser represented. Every chain that bound him was a symbolic breaking of his power. Every mile traveled toward his eventual trial was a processional of revenge. Historians would later note the almost theatrical nature of his capture and transportation. Despenser, once the most powerful man in England after the king, was now reduced to a prisoner, his elaborate clothing replaced with simple, rough garments. The man who had controlled royal finances, who had manipulated land transfers and court politics, was now completely vulnerable. His captors treated him not as a noble, but as a criminal. The journey was deliberately humiliating, exposed to public view, stripped of his previous protections. A living symbol of fallen power. Each town they passed through became another stage in his degradation. The charges against him were meticulously prepared. They weren't simply accusations, but a comprehensive indictment of his entire mode of governance. Misuse of royal authority, personal enrichment, manipulation of legal processes. These were the weapons his enemies would use to dismantle his legacy. In those moments of capture, Hugh Despenser understood something fundamental. Power is never permanent. The networks of influence he had so carefully constructed could collapse with shocking rapidity. His world was not just ending, it was being systematically dismantled, piece by deliberate piece, and this was just the beginning of his ordeal. On November 24, 1326, the marketplace in Hereford transformed into a theater of medieval brutality. Thousands of spectators, nobles, merchants, peasants, pressed together, their breath suspended in anticipation of a revenge spectacle that would become legendary. Hugh Despenser stood bound to a ladder, elevated so every eye could witness his suffering. The man who once controlled England's government, who had manipulated royal power and humiliated Queen Isabella, would now experience a punishment designed not just to kill, but to obliterate his very humanity. This was more than an execution. It was a carefully choreographed performance of political theater, where every moment was calculated to send a message about power, transgression, and consequences. The crowd watched, transfixed, as executioners began their ritualized destruction. First, they placed a crown of nettles on his head, a cruel mockery of the royal influence he had wielded. Verses condemning arrogance were carved into his skin, transforming his body into a living text of judgment. Each cut, each phrase was a statement. No one stands above the collective will of nobility. Then came the true horror. In front of the jeering crowd, Despenser was emasculated, his genitals cut away and burned before his eyes. This was not mere physical punishment, but a symbolic castration of his political and sexual power. Medieval justice understood that true punishment transcended death. It required total humiliation. The chroniclers of the time, Jean Froissart among them, recorded that Despenser's screams were inhuman, a howl of pure agony that echoed through the marketplace, but the spectators didn't flinch. This was justice, medieval style, public, visceral, meant to terrorize potential future transgressors. His abdomen was then opened, and his entrails slowly removed and burned, a process designed to maximize suffering while maintaining consciousness. Medieval executioners were not merely killers, but precise technicians of pain, understanding exactly how much trauma a human body could endure before surrendering to death. This was systematic psychological warfare. By making Despenser's execution a public spectacle, the nobles ensured that every witness would carry the memory, would whisper the story in taverns and courts. His body became a warning, a living, and then dead, message about the dangers of overreaching one's station. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer watched, their faces likely a mixture of vindication and cold calculation. Despenser represented everything they had fought against: corruption, intimate royal manipulation, the destruction of noble privilege. His execution was their statement of restored order. When he was finally hanged, it almost seemed merciful, but even death would not end his humiliation. His body was quartered, with pieces displayed in different cities, a medieval practice of total erasure, ensuring that no physical trace of his memory would remain intact. His head was placed on a stake at London's gate, a grotesque landmark reminding everyone of the fate awaiting those who challenged the delicate balance of medieval power structures. In death, Despenser became more powerful as a symbol than he ever was in life. What makes this moment so chilling is not just the physical brutality, but the systematic nature of the punishment. This was not random violence, but a carefully constructed ritual of political communication. Every cut, every burn, every public moment was designed to reconstruct the social order, to reinforce the hierarchy that Despenser had supposedly threatened. In the end, Hugh Despenser was more than a man. He became a message, written in blood and pain, about the terrible consequences of ambition unchecked. The execution of Hugh Despenser marked more than just the death of a single man. It was a seismic rupture in the fabric of medieval English power structures. His brutal dismemberment became a profound political statement, a visceral warning etched into the collective memory of the nobility. In the immediate aftermath, the power dynamics of the English court underwent a radical transformation. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who orchestrated Despenser's execution, emerged as the new architects of royal authority. Their triumph was complete, yet tainted by the savage spectacle they had just engineered. The message was clear: no favorite, no matter how close to the king, was beyond reach. Despenser's execution sent tremors through the aristocratic networks of medieval England. His death was not merely a punishment, but a carefully designed performance of political theater. The public nature of his torture, the cutting of his genitals, the burning of his entrails, the quartering of his body, was calculated to demonstrate the consequences of overstepping social boundaries. Each gruesome detail was a warning, whispered and shouted across castle halls and village squares. For Edward II, the loss was catastrophic. Despenser had been more than a favorite. He was a lifeline, a conduit of power, possibly a lover. With Despenser's death, Edward's political and personal world collapsed. The king would be deposed within a year, a direct consequence of the power vacuum created by Despenser's elimination. The social impact resonated far beyond the immediate political landscape. Despenser's execution became a cautionary tale about the fragile nature of medieval patronage. Nobles watched and learned. Proximity to power was a double-edged sword. Today, we might see it as an early example of political cancel culture, where public humiliation became a tool of systemic control. Historians would later note how Despenser's death represented a pivotal moment in the evolution of English governance. The execution demonstrated that even royal favorites were subject to collective noble judgment. It challenged the absolute authority of the monarch, suggesting that power could be redistributed, contested, challenged. The psychological warfare was profound. By choosing such a public and horrific method of execution, Isabella and Mortimer didn't just eliminate a political rival, they dismantled his entire social persona. Despenser was not just killed. He was symbolically erased, his body transformed from a site of power to an object of collective punishment. Generations of nobles would remember this moment. The story would be whispered in castle corridors, used as a warning, a threat, a reminder of the precarious nature of medieval power. Despenser became a symbol, not of heroism, but of the dangers of unchecked ambition. In the broader sweep of English history, his execution represented a critical pivot point. It signaled the end of one political era and the beginning of another, where noble consensus could challenge royal prerogative. The medieval understanding of power was fundamentally reshaped. Yet, beyond the political machinations, there was a profoundly human tragedy. Hugh Despenser was a man who rose, who loved, who accumulated power, and who fell with a brutality that still has the power to shock centuries later. His story is a reminder that power is ephemeral, that today's favorite can become tomorrow's cautionary tale. In the end, Despenser's legacy was not just about his death, but about the complex, often brutal mechanisms of medieval political survival. His execution became a lens through which we could understand the intricate, sometimes terrifying dance of power, ambition, and revenge. The echoes of Hugh Despenser's execution would reverberate through centuries of historical memory, transforming a brutal political execution into something far more complex than mere punishment. Medieval chroniclers, those careful preservers of uncomfortable truths, understood that his death represented more than just the elimination of a powerful favorite. It was a profound statement about power, sexuality, and social boundaries. Contemporary accounts reveal a deliberate theatrical choreography of punishment. Each element of Despenser's execution was meticulously designed to communicate a message beyond physical death. The public nature of his torture, the symbolic mutilations, the ritualistic humiliation, these were not random acts of violence. but carefully constructed political performances meant to erase not just a person, but an entire way of existing within medieval power structures. Generations of historians have grappled with the deeper implications of Despenser's fate. Was he truly a villain, or a convenient scapegoat for the complex political tensions of his time? The narrative around him consistently oscillates between portraying him as a cunning manipulator and a victim of aristocratic power games. His relationship with Edward II, whether romantic, political, or both, became a lens through which later generations would examine medieval concepts of intimacy, power, and social transgression. Medieval sexual politics played a profound role in his mythologization. The accusations of sodomy were not merely personal attacks, but potent political weapons. In an era where masculinity was tightly linked to martial prowess and heterosexual reproduction, Despenser's alleged sexual transgressions threatened fundamental social hierarchies. His execution became a symbolic purification, a violent ritual meant to restore what his enemies saw as proper social order. Interestingly, the very brutality meant to erase Despenser's memory instead ensured his immortality. Each retelling of his story became an opportunity to explore the fragility of medieval power, the complex dynamics of royal favorites, and the thin line between political loyalty and betrayal. Chroniclers like Froissart didn't just record his death, they transformed it into a moral parable about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Modern scholarship has complicated these narratives further. Feminist and queer historians have re-examined Despenser's story, challenging traditional interpretations and revealing the nuanced power dynamics that led to his downfall. They've exposed how sexual accusations were weaponized, how personal relationships were inextricably linked with political maneuvering. The physical brutality of his execution speaks to something deeper than medieval justice. It reveals the psychological mechanisms of social control. By destroying Despenser's body in such a public, systematic manner, his executioners were not just killing a man, but performing a ritualistic erasure of everything he represented. Centuries later, Hugh Despenser remains a provocative historical figure, simultaneously a symbol of medieval political intrigue, a potential victim of systemic oppression, and a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersections of personal intimacy and political power. His story challenges us to look beyond simplistic narratives of good and evil, to understand the complex human motivations that drive historical events. In the end, the most profound legacy of Hugh Despenser might not be the manner of his death, but the questions his life continues to inspire about power, sexuality, and the often brutal mechanisms through which societies negotiate their deepest social boundaries.